one of the Soviet submarines stopped communicating. A day passes, and dozens of ships and aircraft begin combing the northern part of the Pacific Ocean. The Soviet Union launched a large-scale search operation. It was not an ordinary submarine that had disappeared, but the K-129, a strategic submarine carrying advanced technology and nuclear missiles, each capable of wiping out a city like Hiroshima. Days, weeks, and a whole month passed, but the search yielded no results. Finding a submarine in the ocean turned out to be more difficult than looking for a needle in a haystack, especially when the haystack covers 2 million square kilometers of deep sea. 6 months later, the USSR officially called off the search operation. No one in the Kremlin suspected at the time that the Americans had long since found K-129. The story takes place in 1968, at the height of the Cold War. The Americans managed to detect a submarine carrying nuclear weapons, secret codes, and the latest military developments. For them, it is a real treasure, but finding the boat is only half the battle. Raising a multi-ton submarine from the bottom of the ocean, from a depth of more than 5 kilometers, is a task that no one has ever attempted before. Moreover, the entire operation must be carried out in strict secrecy. Despite the fact that the USSR had stopped searching for it, the boat remained its property. This meant that the US's actions would be considered the theft of a military object, and thus a potential cause for war. In the late 1960s, the idea of secretly capturing a Soviet submarine caused serious disagreement among the top US military leadership. Numerous generals and analysts spoke out strongly against it. The operation seemed too complex, too risky, incredibly costly, and practically impossible. But while some saw only insurmountable obstacles, others, especially in the CIA, saw this task as a unique opportunity that could not be missed. Thus began the most daring and ambitious covert operation in American intelligence history, Operation Azuria. It lasted several years, required enormous resources, both human and technical, and became a real test of strength for U.S. science, technology, and secrecy systems. All this was done in order to secretly raise the Soviet submarine K-129 from the bottom of the ocean, which carried not only modern nuclear ballistic missiles, but also important documents, codes, and technology samples. This story began at night, when the Soviet nuclear submarine quietly left its naval base in Kamchatka. For the crew of K-129, this sortie was unscheduled. Only recently, in November, had the submarine completed its latest combat duty in the ocean. After 2 months of continuous service, the boat needed repairs, and the sailors needed a long-awaited vacation. Usually, such strategic missile carriers make only 2 voyages per year. However, due to technical malfunctions of other submarines, the command decided to urgently send K-129 to the ocean. The crew consisted of 98 people. The submarine was commanded by an experienced sailor, Captain First Rank Vladimir Kobzer. By the age of 38, he had had a serious career, had a wealth of practical experience, and had been awarded the Order of the Red Star. This duty was to be his last before promotion. He was to take up an office position, overseeing several submarines at once. His deputy, Captain Second Rank Alexander Zurovin, aged 34, was also preparing for career advancement. After returning from this voyage, he could well have taken command of K-129 himself. His wife Irina, like many other wives of submariners, was anxious, but had long since come to terms with the fact that her husband was away from home for months at a time. This way of life had become a kind of unspoken contract with the state. In exchange for stability, benefits, improved housing, and confidence in the future, her husband, like hundreds of other submarine officers, gave the best years of his life to dangerous, stressful, and often unscheduled service. Submariners' families enjoyed certain privileges. Their children attended good schools, their wives were given jobs, and rations and additional salary supplements allowed them to live at a decent level. However, all this apparent stability could always be overturned by a single message: the boat has not made contact. The Pacific Fleet was one of the main pillars of the Soviet Union's nuclear power. Its submarines were not just military vessels, they were elements of strategic deterrence. Each such submarine, including the K-129, could at any moment become an elusive launching pad for a nuclear strike capable of inflicting irreparable damage on enemy territory. These boats posed a direct and continuous threat to the west coast of the United States, especially California, Washington, and Oregon. Although K-129 was launched in the early 1960s, it underwent modernization and received a number of technical improvements by early 1968. New navigation systems, improved hydroacoustic stations, and automated weapon control systems made it fully combat-ready, even by the standards of the rapidly developing Navy. The submarine's main weapon was 3 R-21 intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of hitting targets at a distance of more than 1,400 kilometers. Their thermonuclear warheads had a destructive power dozens of times greater than that of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. In addition, these missiles were launched directly from underwater, which gave them a huge tactical advantage. It was almost impossible to detect the moment of attack, and the flight time was minimal. It was their invisibility, mobility, and stealth that made submarines particularly dangerous in the eyes of the enemy. After all, while the launch silos of land-based missiles could be calculated and even hit with a preemptive strike, the exact location of a nuclear submarine in the ocean was one of the most closely guarded secrets. In other words, the locations of land-based missile bases were generally known, and in the event of war, they would have been priority targets for attack. But the sea was a completely different story. Such boats, including K-129, had the unique ability to become virtually invisible. They could dive to great depths, secretly move to any point in the Pacific Ocean, right up to the immediate vicinity of the U.S. coast, and in the event of a military conflict, deliver a devastating nuclear strike. If this was not considered a superweapon, then what was? After leaving port, the K-129 headed south. At that time, Commander Vladimir Kobzar was not yet aware of all the details of the upcoming mission. According to the general plan, the submarine was to approach the Hawaiian Islands and patrol the waters until its scheduled return to Kamchatka on May 5th. However, the specific instructions were in a special sealed envelope, which the captain was only allowed to open on the third day of the voyage, already in the open ocean. The contents of that envelope remained a secret until the very end. In theory, it could even have contained an order to launch nuclear missiles at targets in the United States. In other words, if the conflict escalated, it was Kobzar who might have become the man who started a nuclear war. Of course, this was an extreme, unlikely scenario. Both Kobzar and his deputy, Captain Second-Rank Zurevin, understood that in practice, their task would most likely be routine covert patrols and maneuvers to evade surveillance by American ships and submarines. The ability to remain undetected is one of the key qualities of a submarine commander. The K-129 was a diesel-electric submarine. Simply put, it operated on a cycle: surface, recharge batteries, submerge again, and so on and so forth. The diesel engine provided higher speed, but was noisy and was only used when near the surface. In simple terms, when the submarine had to surface to recharge, it became vulnerable and easily detectable. Electric motors allowed the boat to move silently at depth, but their autonomy was limited. The batteries did not last long. To recharge, it had to rise closer to the surface and switch to the noisy diesel engine. Communication with the command at sea also played a key role in ensuring secrecy. The Soviet military understood perfectly well that the enemy could intercept radio transmissions. Although Soviet messages were reliably encrypted, the Americans could still determine the coordinates from which the signal was sent. Therefore, K-129 had to maintain radio silence most of the time, communicating only from rare, pre-agreed points. The submarine last transmitted a message on February 25th, after which it submerged into the ocean and went into complete silence for almost 2 weeks. Service on a late 1960s Soviet submarine was not only a matter of great military importance, but also a real test of endurance. It was not only about the enormous responsibility for the nuclear weapons on board, but also about the harsh living conditions. The sailors had to spend 2 months in a confined, cramped space where it was impossible to even stand up straight. The air was saturated with the pungent smell of diesel fuel, and freshness was only a dream. Fresh water was worth its weight in gold. Supplies were strictly limited. Each submariner received only 1 liter per day, for drinking, hygiene, and, if possible, washing. Despite this, all 98 crew members, including the officers, were people who had been hardened by similar conditions. They knew exactly what awaited them and voluntarily carried out their duties. During the first 2 weeks after the K-129 set sail, the command on shore had no particular concerns. According to the schedule, the submarine was supposed to make contact on March 8th. But when the radio signal did not arrive at the appointed time, the officer on duty reported this to his superiors, and an alarm was sounded. The absence of a signal did not in itself mean a disaster. Radio communication underwater is often unstable. The reason could have been bad weather or even the captain's decision to temporarily maintain radio silence if, for example, he suspected the presence of American ships or submarines nearby. However, when K-129 still showed no signs of life on March 9th, the alarm turned into panic. This was unprecedented in the history of the USSR. For the first time, the country had lost a submarine carrying nuclear missiles. The worst nightmare of the Navy command began to come true. Admiral Victor Degelot, commander of the Pacific Fleet Division to which K-129 belonged, was in charge of the search for the submarine. He immediately put forward several possible reasons for the boat's disappearance: communication antenna failure, collision with another vessel, loss of buoyancy due to a serious leak, or an internal fire caused by fuel leakage from the missile compartments. Extreme weather conditions were also not ruled out. Severe storms could have led to flooding. But the exact cause of the tragedy could only be determined in one case: if the submarine itself could be found. Thus began the largest search operation in the history of the Soviet Union at that time. At about the same time, the American nuclear submarine Barb was on duty in the Kamchatka region, carrying out its usual reconnaissance mission. The then commander of the American submarine noticed the extremely unusual activity of the Soviet fleet. More than 30 warships and submarines went out to sea, using sonar and special cameras to comb the ocean both on the surface and underwater. They were assisted by more than 50 aircraft conducting aerial reconnaissance. The scale of the search was explained by the exceptional importance of the missing submarine and the enormous area that needed to be surveyed. The Soviet military knew the route that K-129 was supposed to take and estimated how far it could have traveled by March 8th. But even with these guidelines, the search area was huge. More than 2 million square kilometers. They searched for everything: the submarine itself, debris, oil slicks on the surface, any clues that could indicate its location. The operation was complicated by severe weather conditions and the depth of the ocean in this area, about 5 kilometers. If K-129 had indeed sunk, it would have been almost impossible to detect it at such a depth. By May 5th, the submarine was supposed to return to its base in Kamchatka. The relatives and friends of the crew members tried to get at least some explanation from the command, but most often they were met with evasive silence. The Soviet Navy leadership itself did not have a clear picture of what was happening. No one knew for sure what had happened to K-129, where it was, or whether the crew was alive. The son of the deputy commander of the boat, who was only 8 years old, asked his mother, Irina Zurovina, every day when his father would return. He had never been away for so long before. "Dad is at sea," she tried to answer calmly. It was only in September, 6 months after the submarine's disappearance, that the Navy leadership published a brief official report. According to the official statement, the K-129 submarine was declared lost while on a combat mission, and its crew was presumed dead. This wording was not only a source of emotional pain and uncertainty for the families of the submariners, but also a cause of financial hardship. If the sailors had been officially declared dead, their relatives would have been entitled to a regular pension. But since their status remained presumed dead, the families were only entitled to a one-time compensation payment, just 2 months' salary for a military serviceman. Soon, by order of the Ministry of Defense, K-129 was removed from the list of active submarines, as if it had never existed. Neither the sailors' families nor even the Soviet Navy leadership knew at the time that the Americans had long since determined the location of the missing submarine. The Pentagon is the well-known headquarters of the U.S. Department of Defense. In the late 1960s, the 5th floor of this building housed an office known as the Chief of Naval Operations Office. Behind this neutral name lay a division engaged in top-secret submarine missions. Not only was the public unaware of its existence, but so were the vast majority of Pentagon employees. The main focus of this secret department was to monitor Soviet submarine developments. A month after the disappearance of K-129, the department's employees already had information about the failure of the search operation by the USSR. They were certain that the missing submarine was K-129. This meant only one thing: the disaster involving the Soviet submarine had most likely occurred in this area. For the Pentagon, this was an incredible stroke of luck. Even the Soviet Union, with its precise routes and knowledge of the boat's characteristics, was unable to find K-129. But the U.S., with the help of an acoustic system installed a decade earlier, now had the approximate coordinates of the explosion site. These coordinates made it possible to significantly narrow down the search area. Instead of more than 2 million square kilometers, it was now a matter of a few thousand. Of course, this was still a huge and virtually unexplored part of the ocean, at a depth of about 5 kilometers. However, for the first time, the US had a real opportunity to find the submarine at the bottom of the ocean, with its nuclear warheads, torpedoes, coding systems, and possibly records of military orders. Washington understood that such a find could completely change the balance of the Cold War. If the Americans managed to reach the submarine first, study it, and, even more so, bring it to the surface, it would be the greatest intelligence victory since World War II. But there were several difficult tasks to be solved. How to accurately determine the location of K-129. Many people dream of finding treasures on the seabed. Some hope to discover sunken ships filled to the brim with gold, while others hope to find traces of ancient civilizations hidden in the depths of the ocean. But for Pentagon officials in the late 1960s, finding a Soviet submarine with its military secrets was as significant as discovering the Titanic and Atlantis at the same time. As soon as the coordinates of the possible explosion of K-129 were established, the idea of raising the boat from the bottom arose almost immediately. In theory, it was an excellent idea. In practice, it seemed impossible. The depth of the ocean in this area reached 5 kilometers. The US did not have the appropriate technology capable of extracting such a large target from such a depth. However, at that time, no country in the world had such technology. Moreover, there was no certainty that K-129 had preserved anything really important. If the explosion was powerful enough, it could have destroyed the interior of the submarine. And if the boat remained intact, the pressure of 500 atmospheres and the fall to the bottom could have turned it into a pile of debris. That is why it was decided to conduct reconnaissance first. The converted research vessel Halibut left the U.S. military base in Long Beach. It was originally a regular U.S. Navy submarine, but in the mid-1960s, it underwent a major upgrade. Officially, it became an oceanographic vessel. In reality, the Halibut was a secret reconnaissance vessel equipped with the latest technology: video cameras, sonar, microphones, sensors, and other advanced equipment. It was entrusted with one of the most secret and important missions: to find the Soviet submarine at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. July 1968 marked the beginning of this incredible operation. From the very beginning, everything related to the operation involving the Soviet submarine K-129 was shrouded in the strictest secrecy. Only a select few had access to the information. The mission of the Halibut submarine is a perfect example. First, the purpose of its voyage in 1968 had to remain unknown to the USSR, so the vessel moved as cautiously as possible, avoiding areas where it could be detected by Soviet ships or submarines. Second, even among the Halibut crew, almost no one knew why they had gone to sea. Of the 150 crew members, only a few were aware of the true purpose of the expedition. For example, the underwater camera operator, whose task was to film K-129, did not know that his subject was a submarine. He was simply ordered to photograph the seabed, process the film, and report to his superiors if anything unusual appeared in the pictures. And after 2 months at sea, that unusual thing appeared. One of the grainy black and white photographs clearly showed a submarine lying on the bottom, K-129. Although the hull was broken into 2 main parts, the boat was in surprisingly good condition overall. When Halibut returned to its base in Pearl Harbor, it was already waiting for them. A black limousine pulled up to the pier, and several high-ranking U.S. Navy officers accompanied by security guards got out. The captain handed them a suitcase. Inside were photographs of K-129. The suitcase was immediately sent to Washington. Music. John Parsinski began his career at the CIA in the early years of the agency's existence, immediately after World War II. The son of an immigrant from the Russian Empire, he first served in the Air Force and then became involved in the development of secret aviation projects, including the famous U-2 and A-12 reconnaissance aircraft designed for spying on the USSR. Therefore, when the CIA was faced with the question of who could organize an unprecedented operation to raise a Soviet submarine from the ocean floor, Parsinski was the obvious choice. In July 1969, the operation was officially approved and given the code name Azorian. The reason why the CIA took on the fate of K-129 was not only because of the agency's experience in creating advanced reconnaissance technologies from scratch, but also because of its exceptional ability to operate in complete secrecy. Many in the U.S. military high command were skeptical about the idea of raising the Soviet submarine. First, it was obvious that the operation would require a huge budget, and success was by no means guaranteed. Second, such an action could provoke an international conflict, even war. After all, formally, K-129 remained the property of the Soviet Union. It was a military object, and according to international norms, it belonged to the country whose flag it flew, even if it was at the bottom of the ocean. This meant that the Americans' attempt to secretly retrieve K-129 from under the nose of the USSR was essentially an act of espionage and a violation of sovereignty, especially in the context of the Cold War and the presence of nuclear weapons on board. This could well have been seen as a provocation or even an act of aggression, potentially threatening to escalate into a nuclear confrontation. However, the CIA had a loophole. According to international law, if a country officially ended its search for a missing vessel and waived its claims, the find could be considered ownerless. This is exactly what happened. The USSR ended its search operation and removed K-129 from its fleet registry. In addition, the Americans reminded each other that if the situation had been reversed, the Soviet Union would have done the same. And in fact, it had already done so once. In 1928, it raised the British submarine L-55 from the seabed, restored it, and put it into service under the Soviet flag. Thus, despite the high risks, the prospects were so tempting that the CIA gave the green light and received almost unlimited funding. The project was named Azorian, and now a small team of employees led by John Parsons Sky faced an unprecedented task. At a depth of almost 5 kilometers lay a Soviet submarine weighing about 2,000 tons. How to bring it to the surface intact? Since there was no precedent for such an undertaking, a wide variety of sometimes crazy options for raising the submarine were discussed. Even the craziest ideas were considered seriously. For example, attaching rockets to the sunken submarine and launching it to the surface like a giant torpedo. However, no one could figure out how to then catch the submarine at the surface and prevent it from flying into the sky or crashing back down. This idea was quickly abandoned. Another proposal was to use gas-filled balloons. They were to be attached to the hull of the K-129 to push the boat upward. The concept already sounded more realistic, but a critically important detail remained unresolved: the direction of the ascent. It was impossible to raise the boat just anywhere. The operation had to be as covert as possible. In the end, the CIA settled on a less eccentric but incredibly ambitious and technologically complex plan: to build a giant vessel that could descend to the site, lift the sunken submarine from a depth of almost 5 kilometers, and silently deliver it to American soil. Yes, there were already ships in the world that could lift heavy loads from the seabed. But the largest of them could lift a maximum of 50 tons. And K-129 weighed about 2,000 tons, 40 times more. Then an unexpected idea came to the rescue: manganese. This metal was extremely valuable for metallurgy, and huge deposits of it were indeed found on the ocean floor. In the late 1960s, extracting resources from the depths of the world's oceans was considered one of the most promising areas for the future. For the CIA, this was the perfect cover. Why build a new and extremely expensive ship? To extract manganese, of course. And what is the US Navy doing in the area where a Soviet submarine allegedly sank? We don't know, we're just looking for manganese nodules. In addition, only a few companies could implement such a project, and one of them was Global Marine. It was this company that had experience in building drilling vessels for the oil industry and working at great depths. But here, too, the project faced a new challenge. Everything had to look so realistic that no one would suspect anything. Therefore, the Azorian team formed a special subgroup whose task was to conduct competent and convincing PR for the peaceful project in open sources. In other words, it was necessary to create the impression among everyone, including the Soviet Union, that it was not the CIA but an ordinary private company from the US that was building a giant ship solely for the purpose of extracting manganese from the ocean floor. At the same time, Global Marine, although experienced, did not appear large enough to take on such an ambitious and costly task. This is where one of the most colorful figures of his time, Howard Hughes, came into play. A typical example of an American-style crazy billionaire. A pilot, businessman, film producer, engineer, and at the same time a man with an eccentric lifestyle and many personal quirks. He became the perfect cover for the top-secret operation. If the newspapers reported that Hughes Company was allegedly launching a grandiose manganese mining project, no one would have been surprised. A wealthy eccentric decided to invest in revolutionary technology? It was quite in his spirit. This was the essence of the ingenious cover. The CIA secretly transferred money to Hughes Company, which officially signed contracts with Global Marine to build the ship. Thus, there were no direct links between the intelligence agency and the contractor, and therefore no reason for suspicion on the part of the KGB, Soviet diplomats, or the press. Thus, in 1970, the design and construction of the Glomar Explorer began, a unique vessel with no analogues in the world. The chances of success for the entire operation were estimated at 10%. This is not surprising, given the incredible scale and complexity of the project. Imagine that you are standing on top of the Empire State Building in New York. You are holding a long pole with clamps at the end. Your task is to lower it down 100 floors on a rope, grab a car loaded with gold, and lift it back up. And you have to do it so that no one, neither on the street nor in neighboring buildings, notices anything. Many would say, this mission is impossible. But the CIA thought otherwise. By early 1974, Operation Azorian had overcome perhaps its most lengthy and difficult phase, the construction of the Glomar Explorer ship. It took 4 years, hundreds of millions of dollars, and unprecedented measures to maintain secrecy. Despite all the difficulties, the unique vessel, which was ahead of its time in many respects, was ready to set sail. Its dimensions were impressive. The ship was so huge that it could not only lift a submarine weighing about 1,000 tons from a depth of 5 kilometers, but also completely hide it inside itself for covert transport to a U.S. military base. In the center of the ship was a gigantic internal space, like a well, and at the bottom of the hull were massive doors. Through them, a complex gripping device was extended outside. It was something like a heavy beam lowered on cables, to which a system of mechanical claws was attached. These were designed to grip the submarine's hull and lift it off the bottom. All system control processes were carried out using the latest computers at the time, developed with the participation of specialists from the aerospace industry. But even that was not the most difficult part. The ship had to remain strictly in one place, despite constant ocean currents and waves several meters high. To cope with this, the Explorer was equipped with a unique stabilization system, a gimbal system that adjusted the position of the vessel in real time, compensating for the movement of the water. Thus, the ship literally hovered motionless in the middle of the ocean, despite the waves and currents. The most amazing thing is that the CIA managed to organize all stages of the design and construction of the Glomar Explorer in complete secrecy. The fabricated legend about the ship, supposedly intended for manganese mining on behalf of an eccentric billionaire, worked perfectly. However, this is not surprising. The level of secrecy sometimes reached absurd levels. Operation Azorian had 2 main offices, in Washington and Los Angeles. All communications between them were encrypted, and no one from outside could decipher them. When John Paragonski, the project manager, personally visited the California office, he changed his appearance, wearing a wig and glasses so as not to be recognized. Of the nearly 3,000 people involved in the project, only a few knew the real purpose of the ship's construction. Even at Hughes, which was formally responsible for the project, only a few top managers were privy to this information. It was more difficult to hide the truth from those who were to sail aboard the Explorer into the Pacific Ocean. Although the operation involved CIA personnel, engineers, military divers, and other specially trained specialists, most of the crew, about 150 people, were ordinary sailors hired to operate the ship. Therefore, each of them was thoroughly checked by security services before departure. It was important to make sure that no one would talk too much. After selection, the crew underwent training. It included not only technical and tactical instructions, but also basic Russian language lessons. This was necessary because there could be warning signs on board the Soviet submarine, especially near nuclear weapons. The sailors were taught to recognize words such as nuclear, radioactive, dangerous, and others. In addition, the crew members were prepared mentally in advance. After all, in addition to secret technology and missiles, the K-129 was likely to contain the bodies of dead Soviet submariners. After all stages of preparation, successful equipment testing, and approval from U.S. President Richard Nixon, the Explorer finally left the port of Los Angeles. Ahead lay the most critical and dangerous stage of Operation Azorian. The target coordinates, 40 degrees north latitude and 180 degrees west longitude, pointed to an area of the Pacific Ocean where the Soviet submarine K-129 lay at the bottom. 6 years had passed since the Americans first detected it on the seabed. Now they were back to try to raise the submarine to the surface. It took the Explorer crew several weeks to deploy the complex capture system, calibrate the equipment, and wait for favorable weather conditions. It was not until the end of July 1974 that the descent of the capture system began. The process was slow and extremely cautious. On the one hand, the operation was controlled from aboard the ship, and on the other, some tasks were performed manually underwater by experienced divers. The equipment malfunctioned constantly, and a significant part of the crew was engaged in urgent repairs. Time was running out. The operation could only take place in the summer, when the ocean is relatively calm. The CIA had allocated a window of about 2 months for the entire operation. Outside of this period, strong storms and underwater currents would have made the mission impossible. If they didn't succeed now, there would most likely be no second chance. The project was too expensive, complex, and risky to repeat. And at this tense moment, as the system descended to a depth of 5,000 meters, the Explorer crew spotted a Soviet vessel a few kilometers away. It was a rescue tugboat, small compared to the giant American ship. Nevertheless, the Soviet Union often used such tugboats as reconnaissance vessels, covering them with civilian tasks. Theoretically, the Soviet military could have attempted to board the American ship under the pretext of checking its commercial status. The problem was that the Explorer was literally packed with classified equipment, and the Americans already had unfortunate experience in a similar situation. In the late 1960s, there was the so-called Pueblo incident. At that time, an American reconnaissance ship, operating under the guise of scientific research, was intercepted by the North Korean military. On board were CIA employees and a large amount of top-secret material. As a result, the ship, crew, and all equipment were captured. It was after this incident that the Americans began to actively introduce special self-destruction systems on similar ships. The Explorer was equipped with a sophisticated system for the rapid disposal of secret materials. If the Soviet military attempted to board the ship, all important documents and media would be automatically dumped into special containers on the seabed. Meanwhile, the Soviet tugboat kept a safe distance, patrolling the area a couple of kilometers from the Explorer every day, not getting too close but not leaving the area either. This constant presence heightened tensions among the crew. The main hope was that there were no professional divers on board the Soviet vessel as the operation continued. The Explorer's cameras successfully located the K-129 submarine at the bottom of the ocean, and the decisive stage was about to begin, capturing the submarine with mechanical claws and lifting it. Lifting an object weighing about 1,000 tons from a depth of almost 5 kilometers is an extremely difficult task. The process was very slow and was expected to take several days. However, on August 4th, engineers noticed a sharp change in weight readings. After an urgent analysis, it became clear that one of the claws had broken. Part of the K-129 submarine broke off and sank to the bottom. This was extremely bad news. But there was also some good news. The other part of the submarine was still held by the gripping mechanism and continued to rise toward the Explorer. 2 days passed, and just as the remaining fragment of K-129 was being lifted, a Soviet reconnaissance tugboat suddenly began to rapidly approach the American vessel. The tension on board the Explorer instantly increased. The Soviet vessel came so close that the captain of the American ship was forced to sound a warning signal. The distance between the two ships was reduced to less than 100 meters. Sailors on both sides could see each other in detail. No one on board the Explorer knew what to expect. If the Soviet military had attempted to board the American ship and discovered the illegal operation to raise their submarine, it could have been perceived as a direct military invasion. The entire Explorer crew risked being captured. And then something unexpected happened. When the ships were only about 50 meters apart, the crew of the Soviet tugboat lined up along the side of the ship, turned their backs to the Americans, and the entire crew simultaneously dropped their pants. The American sailors couldn't hold back their laughter, and some of them responded with the same gesture. After that, the Soviet ship gave 3 short blasts and calmly set course back to shore. It later became known that this tugboat had indeed been sent by the Soviet command to check on a suspicious vessel, but, finding nothing criminal and facing a shortage of provisions, the crew simply returned home. Meanwhile, on the Explorer, The entire crew gathered with bated breath in a huge interior compartment. It was here that the lifting mechanism was soon to deliver the captured part of the K-129 submarine. No one knew exactly how much had been salvaged, what condition the hull was in, or what remained inside. The people stood in tense anticipation, ready for the most unexpected outcome. A fragment of the Soviet submarine K-129 slowly rose to the surface from the depths of the dark ocean. Unfortunately for the team, it turned out to be only a third of the submarine. Its most valuable parts, the compartment with ballistic nuclear missiles, the encryption system, and other strategically important equipment, remained at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. The cold depths of the ocean are a reliable preservative. In such conditions, K-129 could have remained in almost perfect condition for decades. But as soon as its hull was exposed to the surface, the destruction began. Temperature and oxygen came into play, instantly triggering the processes of oxidation and decomposition of materials. There was no time to waste. The explorer team immediately got to work. All the objects found were sorted. Technical equipment was sent to one chamber, documentation to another, and the remains of the deceased submariners were placed in special refrigerated compartments. Despite the fact that the most valuable part of the boat remained at the bottom and only a third of the hull was raised, the experts still discovered some very interesting details. Previously, it was commonly believed in the United States that the Soviet Union was significantly ahead in the development of submarine technology. However, the inspection of K-129 gave reason to doubt this. Some sections of the boat's outer hull were made of metal sheets of varying thickness and rough workmanship. In addition, there were heavy pieces of lead on board, presumably used for manual adjustment of the submarine's balance, a very archaic solution. To conduct a final investigation, stationary conditions were required. Therefore, the explorer immediately set course for the U.S. military base in Hawaii. At the military base, specialists dressed in protective suits began cutting open the raised section of the K-129 hull and examining it in detail. The radioactive background in the room was monitored continuously. After all, this was a fragment of a submarine that had previously carried nuclear missiles. The work was carried out at an accelerated pace. The entire process was completed in one day with 2 short breaks. The reason for the rush was simple. The Americans knew exactly when the Soviet spy satellite would fly over the area. To prevent the explorer from detecting what was happening on board, all activity on the deck was completely stopped during the specified time windows. The documents and materials found on K-129 were immediately sent to Washington for further analysis. One of the finds was an undeveloped roll of film, probably belonging to one of the officers. The last frames on it were pictures of his family, his wife and children. A touching reminder that submariners are, first and foremost, people. On the same day, not far from the coast of the Hawaiian Islands, a burial ceremony was held for 6 Soviet sailors whose bodies were found on board the raised fragment of K-129. The identities of 3 of them were established: Vladimir Kostyushka, Viktor Lokov, and Valentin Nozichev. All 6 were buried at sea with military honors, under the fluttering Soviet flag. A former Soviet officer who had previously defected to the United States was invited to conduct the ceremony. He gave a speech on behalf of the American side, beginning with the words, "We bid farewell to the sailors who died in March 1968 in the Pacific Ocean as a result of an accident whose nature remains unknown." Thus ended the unique and top-secret Operation Azorian. But the story did not end there. Soon the CIA began preparations for a new mission, codenamed Matador. Its goal was to return the explorer to the site of the K-129's demise to attempt to recover the remaining, more valuable parts of the submarine. The CIA, a Pentagon representative, and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger discussed the possible continuation of the secret mission. Despite interest in the project, there were many opponents of the idea. Their arguments were compelling. Explorer was already under surveillance by the Soviet military, and its return to the same spot in the ocean would almost certainly raise suspicions and potentially escalate the conflict. Nevertheless, supporters of the second phase of the operation found a compelling argument. More than $200 million had already been spent on the Azorian project, and only $20 million more was needed to complete it. For this relatively small amount, the U.S. could gain access to a wealth of classified Soviet technology remaining at the bottom of the ocean. In the end, the arguments in favor prevailed, and preparations for Operation Matador were launched. In the fall of 1974, An unknown person left an envelope with a laconic message at the door of the Soviet embassy in Washington. The Americans were planning to raise a Soviet submarine from the ocean floor. In those years, such anonymous messages were not uncommon, and most of them turned out to be complete fabrications. Nevertheless, the Soviet ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Dobrinin, decided not to ignore the signal and sent a report to Moscow. The Kremlin's reaction remained behind the scenes, but it is known that no official statements followed. A curious coincidence. Soon, rumors spread through Washington's political and journalistic circles that the CIA had allegedly carried out an unprecedented operation to raise a sunken Soviet submarine with nuclear weapons. A few months later, the Los Angeles Times published a sensational article claiming that the U.S. had indeed raised a Soviet submarine from the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. The article contained many inaccuracies, indicating that the source was poorly informed, but the leak itself was extremely undesirable for intelligence. The article published in the press mistakenly claimed that the submarine had been found in the Atlantic Ocean, and the photo accompanying the article showed a submarine that did not resemble the K-129. Despite these inaccuracies, the essence was close to the truth. The journalists had found the right trail. 2 months later, one of the radio stations released an extensive journalistic investigation. The author of the article knew significantly more details. Although there were inaccuracies here as well, overall the information turned out to be close to the real state of affairs. The story was immediately picked up by the country's largest media outlets, and information about Operation Azorian became public knowledge. This put an end to the Matador project. After such publicity, there was no doubt that Soviet intelligence was aware of the U.S. attempts to raise their sunken combat submarine. The question now was how the USSR would respond. In public, the Soviet Union chose to remain silent. Behind the scenes of the diplomatic front, everything boiled down to official letters in which the Soviet side expressed concern about the American press publications on the fate of their submarine. The United States, in turn, categorically denied its involvement. Neither Operation Azorian nor the construction of the Explorer allegedly took place. The USSR's reaction was understandable. Any open outrage would automatically mean admitting the fact they had lost a submarine with nuclear warheads, were unable to locate it, and did not know what had happened to it. It remains a mystery how journalists managed to penetrate the veil of secrecy that the CIA so carefully guarded. According to one version, one of Howard Hughes' offices was burglarized, and among the stolen documents were materials about connections with intelligence services. According to another version, the information was deliberately passed on to journalists by high-ranking U.S. Defense Department officials who opposed the continuation of the operation. Be that as it may, one of the surprises was that, with the publication of Azorian in the media, even the families of the crew members who participated in the mission learned about the operation for the first time. The participants in Operation Azorian were not allowed to tell even their closest friends and family about their real activities. One day, one of the high-ranking participants in the project was having breakfast at home with his wife. The radio in the kitchen was broadcasting the morning news, and suddenly a sensational story about the Explorer and its secret mission to raise a Soviet submarine came on the air. A short but meaningful dialogue took place between the couple. "Did you hear that too?" he asked. "I did," his wife nodded. "Were you involved in that?" Her husband took a sip of coffee and replied calmly, "I can't say." Although the first details of Operation Azorian leaked to the press in the mid-1970s, most of the information is still classified. The name of the Azorian project was first officially mentioned by the CIA only about 15 years ago. Because of this secrecy, the expression, "we can neither confirm nor deny," appeared and became a meme in the United States. This was how the CIA responded in the 1970s to journalists who, citing the Freedom of Information Act, demanded official recognition of the mission's existence. There is still debate about how successful this most ambitious operation in the history of U.S. intelligence was. It is known that during the recovery, most of the K-129 submarine, about 2/3, broke off and sank again. It was in this part that the most valuable objects were located: nuclear missiles and encryption systems. Nevertheless, the Americans managed to recover part of the submarine with technical documentation, structural elements, and, according to unconfirmed reports, at least one torpedo with a nuclear warhead. The CIA has never disclosed, and may never disclose, the full list of what was found on the recovered part of the K-129 submarine. Some participants in the project, speaking unofficially to journalists, claimed that the finds were extremely valuable. However, The extent to which these statements correspond to reality and what exactly they refer to remains a mystery. Nevertheless, the mere fact that the Americans managed to build a unique vessel in complete secrecy, develop advanced technologies that did not exist before, and, albeit partially, but still accomplish an unprecedented mission is in itself an outstanding achievement. Years later, Admiral Victor Degola described the Azorian project as fantastic in an interview, comparing it in scale to the moon landing. What actually happened to K-129 and its crew of 98 remains unclear to this day. There are several versions, from a technical malfunction that led to an explosion to a possible collision with an American submarine or an unknown vessel. However, there is a more reasonable assumption based on an analysis of recordings from American hydrophones. According to this data, a powerful explosion occurred on the boat while it was on the surface. It is likely that some of the hatches were open at the time, and when the submarine began to submerge, water gradually filled the internal compartments. This slow flooding allowed the hull to remain intact even under the high pressure of the ocean depths. In October 1992, in a unique gesture of goodwill, CIA Director Robert Gates became the first head of American intelligence to visit Moscow. During his visit, he presented Russian President Boris Yeltsin with the Soviet flag used by the Americans at the burial of the K-129 crew, as well as a video recording of the ceremony. It was then that the Russian authorities officially acknowledged the loss of the submarine for the first time. And in 1998, on the 30th anniversary of the tragedy, the entire crew of K-129 was posthumously awarded medals for courage. The relatives of the deceased sailors were taken to the site of the submarine sinking, at coordinates 40 degrees north latitude and 180 degrees west longitude. There, in the silence of the Pacific Ocean, above the bottomless darkness, among the flowers thrown into the water, was the place that became the eternal grave of their loved ones.